Okay, I think it's 6:01 and it's really time to begin. First of all, good evening and thank you for joining me this evening. I expected to have many people on this Zoom call. We don't have, maybe it means something about the importance of the subject. I don't really know. But I think that those of us who participate will be able to gain a lot of understanding of this issue that potentially can blow to be quite a serious one. I think we all know each other, but I like to give this introduction, almost a disclaimer before I talk about Israel. I have dual citizenship, American and Israeli. And like every parent who has more than one child, you know that you can love more than one of them. And I love both my country dearly. And I'm very proud and privileged to have citizenship of both, which leads me to the next point. When I talk about Israel, I'm never objective. I have my bias because the question that I ask myself, intentionally or not, is what's good for Israel? I have a lot of respect for the Palestinians, and I personally think that Israel and the Palestinians will never separate. We are doomed to be together for eternity. Perhaps you can even see some references in the Bible. And when it's good to the Palestinians, it's good to Israel as well. So happy Palestinians are better neighbors. And you can agree or not, but that's something I say. But the main thing that I ask myself is really what's good for Israel. The annexation. We were told that by Bibi Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, that he will start the process of annexation July 1st. Today is July 14th, and I have not heard a thing about the annexation. If you have, please tell us, because I don't believe that anyone made any statement. There was no statement to cancel it. There was no statement that Israel is going forward with it. And I think for a good reason. You know what, let me just mute everyone because there are some background noises here. And then when we'll open it to conversations, just unmute yourself. So just participants. And I am going to.
We have a drink.
Okay, so I apologize for using my ultimate power to do that, but I think it's for a good reason and just better quality of sound. Again, I will stop once in a while to take some questions. I want to, before I even talk about the annexation, I want to say a few things about Israel today. I don't know when was the last time that you visited Israel, but unfortunately in the past 3-4 months, Israel changed dramatically. The COVID-19 affected Israel in a dramatic way. If you remember in the beginning, Israel was one of the best countries in terms of responding to the pandemic. Israel was one of the first to close the airports, not to allow people to quarantine, to even demand to people to wear masks. It did everything right and more until Israel decided, okay, we are out of danger now, and life should go back to normal. Well, we live in Florida, and so we can fully understand what's happening there. There is a surge in cases of COVID-19, major one. People are panicking, and there is no plan, or at least there is no plan that people understand. More than that, Israel is a country of a little bit less than 9 million people, and right now there are more than 800,000 unemployed people. This is huge. Okay, before the coronavirus, Israel had an unemployment of something like 4%, which is close to nothing, very strong economy. This is not the case now. And Israel does not have the coffers, or I don't know how we are going to pay for these $3 billion that we got from the government. That's definitely not the subject of the class, but Israel does not have $3 billion. Okay, I mean $3 trillion. So the economy is bad, and I just want to show you some pictures from the newspapers today. And that's something that you see in Israel every single day. That's the map, definitely not what I was planning to show. This is not Black Lives Matter. This is Jerusalem. And I will go back to the map in a second. For many, many weeks now, on a daily basis, thousands and thousands of Israelis go out to the street to demonstrate. They demonstrate because they're unhappy with the government. The government has no plan. As you know, the Prime Minister of Israel has his own issues, as he has to show up to court on a quite regular basis, as he is accused for corruption and some other things. And so the all optimistic tone that we got used to when we thought about Israel has disappeared. And this is an important backdrop against which the annexation issue is being dealt with. In one poll after another, when the Israelis are asked about the annexation, less than 10%, between 10 and 4%, say that they care about it. Okay, they just don't care. Because when you're worried about your health, when you're worried about not having a job, the annexation is not important. It's not that it was vastly important before. It's something that most people did not really understand. But right now, they call it a spin. And they use the English word for spin. They said that Netanyahu, instead of dealing with the real issues, he wants to distract the Israelis' attention from his legal problems into something that nobody really cares about. And Netanyahu is the prime minister, but for the first time in the history of Israel, Netanyahu has a co-prime minister. Okay, this is Benny Gantz. If everything follows the initial plan, and I don't think that the odds are great, in about a year, Benny Gantz will become the prime minister, and Netanyahu will be the sort of number two or the other co-prime minister. But right now, it's Netanyahu. But Benny Gantz said the other day, he said, we should not deal with it as long as the corona continues to affect us. He said, let's just pause. So if you are wondering, what do Israelis think about it? They don't. They have a lot to think about besides that. What is the annexation? Because we use this term quite a lot. We've been using it, and we even had a class, I don't know, probably in January, something like that, when Netanyahu came up with the idea of the annexation, or at least an annexation of the Jordan Valley. But annexation did not start this year. Annexation started at the year of 2012 by an Israeli politician. His name is Naftali Bennett. I don't know if you heard the name. Naftali Bennett was really close to Bibi Netanyahu, but it seems like, and I'm not cynical here at all, it's factual what I'm saying, almost everyone who has been really close to Netanyahu at one point found himself, sometimes herself, starting a new political party. And that was the case of Bennett. So if Netanyahu is on the right side of the political spectrum, Bennett is right of Netanyahu. And in 2012, when Bennett formed his political party, he said that if he is elected, he will use his political power in order to annex large part of the West Bank. When he was talking about it 8 years ago, it sounded like somebody today is going to talk about segregating schools again. It was just unheard of. Nobody was even thinking about annexation. And when I say annexation, I'm talking about an annexation of part of the West Bank without any agreement with the Palestinians. A unilateral annexation, okay? Nobody talked about it. It was a taboo. It was something that you just don't talk about. But ideas have their own way to develop, and this is no different. And when Netanyahu, remember that we had 3 elections within a year. When Netanyahu realized that he's not getting enough support from the right wing, he adopted the idea of annexation to a point that he promised that if he is elected, July 1st, 2020, he will begin the process of annexation. Okay, so far so good. Now, there is another thing that I meant to say in the beginning. I will say it now. It's really important. One cannot talk about this subject without referring to American politics. I will talk about it, but by no means I'm taking any partisan side. All I'm talking about is just facts. Please don't read into my comments. I'm going to talk about Trump, and I'm going to talk about Biden, and I'm going to talk about Republicans and the Democrats, but only in connection to the discussion, okay? I don't want to get emails and texts afterwards, why you said, I'm not going there. And when you ask questions or you make comments, please don't go there either. It's just not the subject. But we cannot pretend that this is not an important part of the discourse about the annexation. So far, so good. So let me go to the map that I think will shed a lot of light on the subject. This is the map of the West Bank, more or less the way it was drawn during the Oslo Agreement or the Oslo Accord. You see the West Bank, this line is the Jordan River, okay? This side is Jordan, if you see my cursor. This is the Dead Sea. Up there, not on the map, is the Sea of Galilee, but this is the entire West Bank. The West Bank, according to Oslo, and this is still the terminology that everyone uses, is divided to 3 areas. First area is area A, where you see the yellow, right? The bright yellow. This is an area that is fully controlled by the Palestinians. This is an area that no Israeli should go to. This is, in my opinion, an area that no tourist should go there. Okay, sometime when we go with groups, they say, can we go to Hebron here? Can we go to Jericho? Because people know these biblical places. I would not even dare, because Israel is not there. Even militarily, it is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Okay, so this is area A, completely under control of the Palestinian Authority. Area B is this brownish color that you see here. These are areas that are controlled civilly by the PA, Palestinian Authority, but militarily controlled by Israel. Okay, this is area B, and area C is all the blue you see that is fully controlled by Israel. In percentage, area C is about 60% of the West Bank, and the other two are about 40, as it's easy to do this kind of math. Okay, now when Israel is talking about annexation, nobody ever defined what part Israel is planning to annex. Okay, Netanyahu or anyone from the Israeli government never mentioned what Israel was going to annex. Very likely what Israel was planning to annex is Israeli settlements that are very close to the Israeli border. So you see this point that I'm showing here, it's called Dariel. It became a city. It's a very large Israeli settlement, okay? And there is no way that it is not going to be part of Israel. You go to Jerusalem here, you see that there is Ma'ale Domim, there is Efrat, there is Kfar Etzion. These areas, de facto, are part of Israel. Okay, they're not recognized by the world as part of Israel. Israel did not recognize them officially as part of Israel, but de facto, they are part of Israel. So the assumption is that Netanyahu will start by annexing these territories that will probably be something like 30% of the West Bank. Now, try to imagine what is going to happen when these areas are going to be part of Israel. Israel will have to start building bridges and roads and walls around it and employ many more soldiers to protect it, etc. But that's the idea. I want to take the opportunity when we have the map in front of us to talk about the Trump peace plan because this is really important. According to the Trump plan, which was made mostly by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Israel is going to keep about 30% of the West Bank. And here is the but. The Palestinians are going to control 70%, meaning the Palestinians are going to have a Palestinian state in 70% of these territories, plus Israel will give the Palestinians land from the Negev, right, from the south of Israel, from the desert, which will amount to about 15%. Okay, this is the Trump plan. So Israel will have to agree to a Palestinian state. In addition, Israel will have to give the Palestinian part of the Negev. This is the Trump or Kushner plan, really important to remember. Okay, before I continue, I want to see if there are some questions. Miles, I can see you. I don't see everyone, so just unmute yourself and ask the question.
How did those areas get determined in the first place? The A, B, and C?
The A, B, and C, that was the Oslo Accord. If you remember, remember when they met many years ago, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat and King Hussein from Jordan, okay? This is the Oslo Accord. So everyone agrees on these definitions. Not everyone agrees what should happen with them, right? Because the Palestinians, of course, would like to have the entire area as their Palestinian state, 100%. The extreme right wing in Israel, of course, would like the Palestinian to magically disappear. and to make the entire area part of the state of Israel, okay? But everyone agrees on these 3 zones or 3 areas, okay? Other questions? In this area today live about 500,000 Jews or 500,000 Israelis, and we don't have an accurate number, so I have to give you a range between 1.6 and 3 million Palestinians. And this is small. This area is really, really small, okay? So there are at least 2.6 million Palestinians here. Israel has annexed territories in the past. Immediately after 1967 war, the 6-day war, Israel annexed East Jerusalem, right? That's why when you go to Israel, you can go to the Western Wall, and you know that the entire city of Jerusalem belongs to Israel, which has not been the case before 67. In the early 80s, Israel annexed the Golan Heights, territory that Israel occupied from Syria. But there's one huge difference between the West Bank and the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights did not have people. It was heights, empty mountains, no population. Here we're talking about 2.6 million. And before you ask me the question, or should you ask yourself, I'm not even including about 2.5 million Palestinians who live in Gaza. This is just the West Bank, okay? So we have a lot of people there, which is important to keep in mind all the time. Why didn't Israel go ahead with the annexation so far? The only person who would determine whether or not Israel would annex the territories is Donald Trump. It's not a political statement, that's the reality. And Donald Trump, 4 months before the election, will do what he thinks would be better to increase his odds to win the presidency, the election, right? And I'll explain why Donald Trump did not give yet the green light. Now, let me tell you how I feel about it. I'll tell you a story that I remember somebody from my synagogue in New York told me. And perhaps you heard of similar stories. So there was an old aunt who died and left the house to several of the nieces and nephews. They didn't do much with it. But sometime later, one of the nephews lost his job, was between jobs, and decided to move into this house for only a few weeks until he's back on track. As you can imagine, these few tricks expanded to few months, to few years. During this period, there was some grumbling by the other nephews, the other cousins, but for the most part, everyone wanted to keep peace in the family, and they didn't say a word and allowed this nephew to stay in the house rent-free. Until at one point, the nephew at one of the family gatherings said that, you know, he took care of this house for many years. He invested in keeping it up and even remodeled it. And he came up with an offer to give all the other cousins a little bit of money, much less than the fair value of the house. And they should transfer the deed of the house to him. What do you think happened? He lost the house. They went to court and lawyers and the whole thing. And the guy who lived for free for years and could have stayed there, probably for the rest of his life, lost that house, okay? It's not a complete analogy to what's happening with the annexation issue, but it's similar. And that's why I thought about this story, which I have not thought about for probably about 20 years. Israel controls big parts of the West Bank, okay? 30% at least of the West Bank, de facto, not de jure, but de facto belongs to Israel. In the beginning, the Arab world opposed to it, Europe opposed to it, many American presidents opposed to it, but nobody did anything really to prevent Israel from holding these territories and allowing Israel to keep building more and more settlers. Now when Israel wants to make it formal, to make it legal, I don't know how you want to make it, Israel can only lose. There is almost nothing that I can come up with, or that I found anyone to tell me what Israel can gain right now by annexing these territories. At the same time, the risk is really high. Willing to hear a little bit about the risks. I'm going to talk about several dimensions here. Let me talk with money, okay? Let me just start with the economy, because the economy, as I said in my remarks in the beginning, is the number one thing that worries the Israelis. Those who join us later, I just want to emphasize that Israel has been in a serious recession now for over 3 months, with an unemployment of more than 800,000 people. And it's a huge number when we talk about a population of 9 million, okay? Now, the high tech, I don't know how many of you read the book several years ago of Israel, the high tech nation. High tech is very big in Israel. Israel is one of the leading countries in high tech. And the captains of the high-tech industry normally do not want to be involved in politics. And they have a good reason to do that. Only that recently they do talk a lot, because they are really scared that annexation, especially during such an economic recession and problems, can risk everything that they have been building for almost 30 years. So let me just give you some figures here, according to Israeli economists. Should Israel annexes the entire West Bank, okay, the entire map that I showed you, the cost to Israel is going to be 67 billion shekels, which is, let's say, about $17 billion a year, annually, 17 billion a year, okay? May not sound like a lot of money to you, but when you look at the overall budget of Israel, it's huge, okay? Now, Israel will get back $12 billion from taxes that Israel will collect from the Palestinians. But we're still left with 52 billion shekels a year, which means 26,000 new Israeli shekels, which is about, let's say, something like $7,000 a year per Israeli family in order to support the Palestinians. And why would Israel need all this money? Because now the Palestinian Authority has to take care of health, of education, of infrastructure, a lot of security. If Israel annexes it, it's on Israel, okay? In addition, the cost of security will go up significantly. Now, part of the budget of the Palestinian Authority, which is not doing well economically, it did very poorly before the corona, but as the corona affected Israel, it also affected the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank as well as the Gaza Strip, okay? So a horrible economy that was affected by the coronavirus is much worse. Now, big chunk of their money comes from donations. A lot of donations come from the Emirates, from the Gulf state countries. It comes from the EU, the US stopped giving any help to the Palestinians, okay? Should Israel annexes it and takes over, this money is not getting there. Israel is not going to get the same donations that they got. So in other words, it's going to cost a fortune to Israel. And right now, Israel does not know how to get out of this recession that was caused by the COVID-19, okay? Let alone how to deal with the new expenses. So this is just from economic point of view. Any comments or questions about that? Okay. Other problems here. What's going to happen to the neighbors of Israel? So when we talk about neighbors, we're talking about mainly Egypt, Jordan, the Palestinians, and recently the Gulf states became a very important actor in the region, and Israel has really good relationship with them that is getting better and better, and there is more and more military, technological and economic collaboration between Israel and countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates, etc. Okay? So these are the main factors in the area. Let's start with Egypt. It's easy. I don't think that they really care. Egypt doesn't really care. The Egyptian leader, Sisi, would probably condemn it. He already did. But they don't really have a dog in this race. So Egypt is not a major concern. Jordan is a different story. Jordan is a small, fractured, poor country. Jordan's population is made of mostly Palestinians whom are hardly controlled by King Abdullah. It's a challenge to control them, and they have a lot of criticism. They especially hate his wife, but I won't go into Jordan. That's an interesting story on its own, but Jordan is really afraid that if Israel annexes the West Bank, the Palestinians in Jordan will start an uprising. A very fragile situation there can easily get out of control. The Jordanian king has been threatening Israel continuously that this will be the end of the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel. This will be the complete end of the relationship and the collaboration between these two countries. I want you to remember that the longest border that Israel has is with Jordan. It's wonderful for Israel to have peace with the Jordanian. It's not wise to risk it. Let's go to the Emirates. The Emirates like the cooperation with Israel. For many years, they didn't want to talk to Israel because they took upon themselves to be the patrons of the Palestinians. Frankly, I think they got tired of it. Palestinians did not do their part in trying really to honestly negotiate with Israel. The Palestinians still are very corrupt. They failed in building the economy. They received a lot of money from these countries, but did not deliver, okay? So they say, okay, let the Palestinians deal with their own issues. We will give them enough money to keep them quiet, but we want to reap the benefits from doing business with a country like Israel. And it's not just economy, it's also intelligence, military intelligence, okay, which they need. And we'll talk about the main reason. However, and they made it very clear, because they are also not the most stable countries in the world. If Israel annexes the West Bank, it's going to be the end of this relationship. They just cannot afford it. There will be a rebellion against them within the streets of the country. Okay, so in the Arab countries, you have to know there is a big difference between the street and the leaders. The leaders have a lot of control, but they need to keep the people on the streets happy and calm. When that not happens, you see what happened, what we call the Arab Spring. I don't know how much you follow, but there is a war now in Libya. It's just doesn't make the papers here, but it's very easy over there for a fire just to start almost from nothing. Okay, this relationship is really good to Israel, and we don't want to miss it. Now, why do we love the Gulf countries so much, and why do they love us? Besides money and technology, we have a common enemy, Iran, or if you will, Iran and Turkey, which get very close together recently, and they become the enemies of the Gulf countries, and of course, they're the enemies of Israel. See what's happening with Iran. Netanyahu did something quite successfully and very important, very good. For more than a decade, Netanyahu was telling the entire world that the biggest risk to the world is Iran. It took him some time, but finally the world, and especially the United States, was convinced. So if before the world cared a lot about the Palestinians, now the world, when the world thinks about the Middle East and the area, their concern is about Iran and the nuclear plants, etc., right? What is happening in the past month or so, Iran, from being on top of the Middle East agenda, is steadily going to the bottom and being replaced by the Palestinian issue. So for 10 years, Israel tried to bury this issue, to take it off the agenda quite successfully, and all of a sudden, it's up there. The Gulf countries want to work with Israel against Iran and Turkey. They want to work with Israel and the United States against Iran and Turkey. But it will be much harder for them to do that if Israel annexes the West Bank and when there is an uprising in their own countries, because the residents of these countries will take it as an insult on Islam, okay? And not everyone always thinks rationally. So this is another major issue to think about. Before I continue, any questions or any comments? Okay. Here is, I believe, one of the most important risks that we may be taking by annexing the West Bank. And this is the Palestinian Authority. They know there is no great love between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. You know, who watches Fauda, or who watched Fauda? Fauda is good. And I have not watched the last season, but what I watched in the beginning, you see a lot of collaboration between the security agencies of the Palestinians and the Israelis. And this is true. This is absolutely true. Can you think about the last time that there was any terrorist attack from the West Bank? Not Gaza. There are missiles from Gaza, but West Bank is a different territory, right? It has different government, different leadership. When was the last time that Israel had issues with the West Bank? It's also quiet. It's also beautiful and peaceful, at least since 2000, okay? And why do you think this is the case? This is the case because the Palestinian Authority is taking care of the terrorists there. They work with the Israelis, but they work very hard because terrorism is bad for them, it's bad for their image in the world, and it's bad for Israel. What the Palestinian authorities or the PA said to Israel, and they started actually to show that they are serious. They said, if you annex the territories, our security collaboration is done. By all means, they say to Israel, go back, come back to the West Bank, bring more soldiers. You take care of the terrorists. You try to prevent all these attacks from the West Bank and Israel. We are done. And that can happen in two ways. One is that the Palestinian authorities, Mahmoud Abbas, their leader, would say, no more Palestinian Authority. Or there will be an uprising there, not against Israel, but against the authority, and there won't be Palestinian Authority. 2.6 million Palestinians. What do you think is going to happen when the Palestinian Authority is dissolved? Israel has to go in. And what's happening when Israel goes in? Israel has to take care of all the security issues, the last thing the IDF wants, because the IDF works hard enough. The IDF works very hard to focus on the threat from Iran, from the Gaza Strip, from other places. It's really happy not to have to deal with the West Bank. But Israel, as the controlling country, has to provide them with what I mentioned before, with health and with education and with infrastructures and with everything else. This is no longer the responsibility of the PA. It is the responsibility, it will be the responsibility of Israel. This is the biggest headache Israel can imagine. So we can like the Palestinian Authority or not, we can criticize them, and we should criticize them, but at least they do their job in controlling their people and providing their people with what they need, and more or less defending the border with Israel. When they dissolve, we are going back many years, and we don't want to be there. We don't want to control 2.6 million Palestinians now, okay? And if we do, you remember all these talks about apartheid? You will hear it more and more, right? People compare Israel to South Africa and call it apartheid. Israel can quite easily say that's not the case. The Palestinian authorities control their own people. The Hamas controls Gaza. But if Israel goes in, Israel will have to make a choice. They cannot just control it. They have to either give them citizenship, right? Or give them a state. But Israel will no longer be able to say, okay, we control you, our army is there, but we're not giving you full rights. Okay? So this is a major risk. Let me just look at the list that let's talk a little bit about American politics. It's really important, and I'm going to repeat what I said. I'm really not taking any sides in the partisan debate and in the election that we'll have in November, but this is a major part of the issue here. Let me go back about 5.5 years ago. It was one of my high holiday sermons because it scared me a lot. During the debate whether or not to sign the agreement with Iran, that was during the Obama administration, something unprecedented happened. The Israeli Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, seems like you just say Israeli Prime Minister, it's always Bibi Netanyahu recently, came to the United States to talk to join to the House to the Senate and the Congress, okay? That's not a rare thing, but it is unprecedented for a leader of a foreign country to do that without an invitation by the president of the country. He did not ask the president. He announced to President Obama that he is coming to talk to the Congress and the Senate. It doesn't matter at that point what you thought about the Iran deal or what you thought about President Obama, but as American citizen, now I'm wearing this hat, I was offended. I was really offended because that was discourteous, but more than that, I strongly believe that the reason that Israel survived and Israel prospered is its relationship with the United States of America. America gets a lot from this partnership. Don't miss, really gets a lot, but this is not an equal partnership. We, now, Israelis get much more from it. We get all the military support, we get serious economic support, we get political support. Okay, whenever the UN brings up anything, any resolution against Israel, almost always the US vetoes it. Okay? And my fear at that time was that what Netanyahu did would start a process of erosion in the relationship between Israel and the United States, and more specifically between Israel and the Democratic Party. And still is, for the most part, but is getting more and more eroded, less and less. Israel has been a bipartisan issue. When Israel was brought up, if it's this military security, if it's the financial security, no matter what, and when you follow AIPAC and other, almost an overwhelming number, almost over 90% of the Congress supports Israel. Both sides, Democrats, Republicans, there was almost no difference whatsoever. But when Israeli Prime Minister snubbed the Democrat president, you know what? Nobody made a huge deal out of it. Obama just at that time told the ambassador in the UN not to veto a resolution against Israel. It didn't have any meaning except of making a point. But since then, those of you who follow, you can see that Israel is becoming more and more a wedge issue that is supported mostly by the Republicans. Now, I'm not saying that the Democrats do not support Israel. Still, the vast majority of the Republicans support Israel. But there are more and more voices that are calling not to end the support, but they're calling, just let's check if we really need to give this money and what Israel is doing with the money. And the more strength the progressive side of the Democratic Party gains, the less support Israel gets. Israel should never become a wedge issue in American politics. We worked for 72 years in order to remain a bipartisan, 73 years. We must remain like that, okay? It's so important. President Trump may win or may not win, but there will be eventually a Democratic president. 2020, 2024, you all know the history of America as well as I do, if not better, okay? It shifts every few years. And Israel should never worry what would happen if the president comes from the Democratic Party and if the Senate and the Congress are controlled by it. This is a major thing. 191 Congress members sent a letter last week or 2 weeks ago to Israel. I don't know if you saw it. A very polite, nice letter urging them to rethink the annexation, telling them that this is not the right timing for that. Okay? So Israel being supported only by one party, not good for the Jews. Not good. Okay? It's a major risk. Let me give you a little bit more nuances because it's really important here. Where is President Trump stands on that? Two important points. One is that when Trump made the statement that he would greenlight the annexation, there was a different government in Israel. It was a government only headed by Netanyahu. Now it's a different government with two big parties, Kahol Lavan, blue and white, and the Likud party, with two prime ministers, sort of, Gantz and Netanyahu, okay? So it's not the same. But here is the main difference. When Trump was talking about annexation, he was talking about it in the context of Trump's plan. And I talked about it in the beginning, but I need to remind you, Trump's plan is a really difficult one, but still it talks about a two-state solution, okay? The Palestinians will get 70% of the West Bank, okay? Annexation without a Palestinian state was not necessarily part of what Trump had in mind. It was supposed to be the leverage that Israel and America has over the Palestinians in order to bring them to the negotiation table. However, when we read the agreement, and we had a class that we read it, or parts of it, when you read the agreement, the way it was written, it basically gave permission to Israel to start the annexation without even a peace process, without any negotiation. And the day in January, the day off actually, when Netanyahu was in the lawn of the White House, all smiling, he wanted to start the annexation immediately. Only that Kushner told him, chill. Said, I understand that that's your understanding of the plan, but that's not what we have in mind right now. And here is an important distinction to make. When we're talking about the Trump administration with regard to the annexation, I want to talk about Kushner and about David Friedman. David Friedman is the American ambassador in Israel. David Friedman has not been a politician. He was Trump's bankruptcy lawyer. And here is the important thing. He was a huge supporter financially of these settlements. He personally believes that Israel should control the West Bank and make the West Bank part of Greater Israel. That's where he comes from ideology. Ideology, yeah, that's it, okay? He did something that is really weird for people who follow very closely. It seems like he does not have too much confidence in Trump's re-election. So he wants Israel to annex the West Bank right now, before the election, because he knows that for his personal belief, this is the moment. Probably takes it like some Israelis, some settlers, as a divine message. You can do it now. The world has issues. We have a corona. We have the most supportive president in the history who would allow you to do anything you want. Do it now. That's what David Friedman, the American ambassador in Israel, wants to do. He's afraid that the window of opportunity is closing down. On the other hand, we have Jared Kushner. Jared Kushner has looks at the issue in a much broader way. He's not in love with the territories. I don't know what he's feeling towards them. It doesn't really matter. But Jared Kushner cares about two things, at least in this regard. He cares about the Trump plan because this is his plan. Okay, he's the architect of the plan, of the peace plan. And he knows that in order for that to work, Israel needs to negotiate with the Palestinians, not to start the annexation. Okay, so he's for annexation as part of a peace agreement, but not a unilateral annexation. That's where he and Friedman disagree. But Kushner has another interest. Kushner has very good political and personal relationship with the Gulf countries. He does not want to upset them. Not as Kushner and not as a representative of the Trump administration. Okay, so if David Friedman, the ambassador, cannot care less about the Gulf countries, it's really important for Kushner. Okay, and Kushner and Friedman are on both sides of this disagreement. Who is stronger at this point? I don't really know. And only time will tell us. Now, what would Israel get from it? As I said in the beginning, it's really hard to know. It's a huge risk that Israel is taking. And the question is, what would Israel gain? Israel has taken huge risks from the very beginning. Just declaring Israel in May 14th of 1948 was a huge risk, knowing that a minute later, all the Arab countries will attack Israel, which of course happened, right? When Israel had enough intelligence that the Iraqis were going to build a nuclear reactor, Israel bombarded it in 1981. When Israel had intelligence that the Syrians are trying to build nuclear weapon, that was during the Olmert's time, Israel bombarded it and destroyed it. Okay, Israel is not afraid of taking risks, but when the risks are worth it, when the benefit will be meaningful and hopefully greater than the risk. Right now, there is no convincing answer. What would Israel get? And even if everything that I said to you will not happen, and the Palestinian Authority will be fine, and the Jordanian will be fine, and the Emirates will be still happy with Israel, and the United States, both the Democrats and Republicans will keep support. What would Israel gain? Israel controls these territories. Nobody wants Israel to get out of there. Israel has already de facto annexed them, uses them as if they belong to Israel. Why taking this risk? What can Israel gain from it? And I'm asking because I don't really have a good reason. I really don't. I will tell you that Israel will end up annexing the West Bank ultimately, or parts of it, because Israel, the 500,000 Israelis are not going to leave. All these settlements are not going to disappear, okay? Israel will end up annexing them, but hopefully it will be part of a dialogue with others. And let me just end with one point that is important to know and keep it very deeply not deeply, keep it in your mind, because it's I look at it as a game changer. When people check the Palestinian streets, when they talk to the young Palestinians, you know what they want in the future? They don't want the Palestinian Authority to control them. You know who they want? They want Israel. And they're right, because they're Israel's neighbors. They look at Israel. They know what's happening in Israel. Israel is great, one of the best countries in the world, right? Technology, economy, culture, Nobel Prizes, right? They look at what they have. Their GDP is something like 1/40 of the GDP of Israel, right? So they're saying now, okay, forgot about politics and all this stuff. These people, the Israelis, know how to take care of a country. They have their issues. They didn't treat us well. But look at the results. They have a beautiful country. We want them to manage us because our Palestinian Authority failed doing it. They don't know how to run a country. These Israelis know how to do it. Let them take over. Let Israel take over the West Bank and let us be citizens of Israel. That's their dream. They stopped dreaming of having a Palestinian state. They want to be Palestinian Israelis. By the way, 20% of Israel today are Israeli Palestinians, right? They want to be like them. They want the Israeli ID, the right to work in Israel. What's wrong with that scenario? If you have 2.5 or 2.6 or 3 million Palestinians from the West Bank, and you have a similar number from Gaza, Israel will have to choose between being a Jewish state or a democracy. But being a Jewish democracy will not happen because you'll have a majority of non-Jewish people in this large country that includes Gaza, the West Bank, and what Israel is today. So if Israel annexes them and decides not to give them citizenship and the necessary rights, Israel will cease being a democracy, okay? If Israel will give them citizenship and rights, Israel will not remain a Jewish state anymore, any longer, okay? This is not good for Israel, or at least the way I want Israel to be, because I personally want Israel forever to be a Jewish state. I don't want Israel to be just a binational country. I want it to be a Jewish state. And annexing is not going to lead to it immediately, but it might be a very important, crucial step into this unfortunate outcome. Any questions? Sharon, just unmute yourself. You're still muted.
I was saying, I know you don't want this to be a partisan discussion, but I wonder if Trump sees this as a big win for him, and it's sort of like a quid pro quo for having Jerusalem named the capital of Israel. And that he sees this going into the election as a really big, major to-do that's going to garner him some votes.
But that's a question that political scientists try to answer. Who is going to appreciate it?
Yeah.
The majority of the Jewish community in the US is not supporting of it.
But the evangelicals might like it.
The evangelicals were asked many times in the last month, they don't care about it. Because the annexation is not something that would make them happy. It's a technical thing. What they really don't want is a war in the holy sites, okay? So, and some, that's not, I just don't have the knowledge, but according to some experts, that's the reason that Trump is not in a rush to do it, because he's asking, who is going to appreciate it? Who is going to vote for me because I did it? If anything, I can get myself now being criticized by even more people without reaping any benefit. Now, it's one thing if Trump would get the Nobel Prize as the one who finally brought peace to the Middle East, etc. That's not going to happen in the next 4 months, okay?
True.
So this is a great question, and those who answer it and had polls among the evangelicals, they don't care about it. As I said in the very beginning, Israelis don't care about it. So would you think that the evangelical are just waiting, wow, annexation is going to make us happy? Not likely. Anyone else? Miles.
You said you're not sure what the advantage is for Israel and annexing. What is the motivation of Netanyahu and Friedman? What do they say? Is there just a reason?
You know, it's not fair for me to tell you because I don't know. You're the psychologist, if anything, but saying that. Friedman is driven by his ideology. He has always been known as a huge supporter of the territories, of the settlements. Okay, so as a Jew, that's what he believes in. There are many Jews who believe, and that's what drives him. Netanyahu is driven, and now I might be a little bit cynical, or you can at least blame me for being that. Netanyahu has a huge issue. Netanyahu is charged and has to appear in court on a regular basis. He does not want the public opinion to focus on his legal issues, and he does not want to be remembered as the prime minister who went to jail. We already had Olmert. I just mentioned to you that Olmert was the one, under his prime ministership, Israel destroyed the nuclear reactor in Syria. Who knows that? Almost nobody. Who knows that Olmert was the prime minister who went to prison? Everyone. That's how he's remembered, okay? But at least he went to jail not as a prime minister. It happened after he lost the election. Netanyahu potentially can be the first prime minister who goes from the prime minister house to prison. He doesn't want that to be his legacy. He wants his legacy to be the one who started the annexation, who actually turned part of the West Bank to be Israel. This is a legacy that might not be important for a big part of Israel, but for everyone on the right, this is big, okay? That's what he wants to be remembered for. And the other thing that people do, and if you remember the pictures I showed you in the beginning, Israel has absolutely no plan now for the COVID and for the economic crisis, okay? Talking about something else is wonderful. And that's why they are telling him, and all these demonstrations said, forget about annexation. We don't want to talk about annexation. We want to talk about COVID, and we want to talk about money. We want to talk about economy. Okay, so he has a good reason to distract people from discussing the COVID and the economy. And he's blamed because as I said in the very beginning, he treated it, or the Israeli government treated the COVID so much better than 95% of the world, only that ended too early and to mess up completely, and now it's out of control. He doesn't want that to be the discourse. He wants to divert it somewhere else. Anyone else?
Yeah, Rabbi, it was fascinating. I had the same perspectives as you, but now at least I have a factual basis for it. So thank you.
You, Larry.
The thought I had is, you know, when Netanyahu started this back in January and through the early part of the year, whether there's always a belief that this was going to be the hammer or the bludgeon to force some negotiations, but as the world turned its attention to COVID, that capability for everybody could no longer focus. The Israelis, the U.S., everybody. So do you have any sense that it was always really just a high pressure negotiation tactic, or do you think it was really a legitimate, let's try and really get to annexation?
I think that there was misunderstanding between Trump or the Trump administration and Netanyahu. I think that Trump wanted a peace agreement, and Netanyahu just took it as an unconditional support, helping him, Netanyahu personally, to fulfill his dreams. And he really thought that Trump would help him personally to do that. But Trump, as the president of the United States, has to put the United States first. Okay, so annexation, and as you said, and many people agree with you, was supposed to be at least part of the negotiation, leverage to bring the Palestinians in. But when it became clear that it's not going to happen, and definitely the COVID-19 changed the world, there is really, I don't see why Trump would like to support it any longer. It's not helping him, it's not helping Israel. And what Trump did, the administration, was something quite smart. They went to Benny Gantz, the co-prime minister, and asked him, what do you think? Okay, because they say, if you and your party completely agree, we may give you the green light. And Gantz said, in principle, I think that Israel, under some conditions, should annex parts of it, but this is not the time to do it. So if the Israeli prime minister, it's hard for me to say because it never existed, says that this is not the time, and everything, all the effort in the country has to go towards COVID and economy, does not want to support it, Trump is not just going to please Netanyahu on a personal basis. I think that Netanyahu probably over-appreciated his personal relationship with Trump. That's only my opinion. But what do I know? Alan, you're muted. You're muted, Alan. There is a new version now of Skype in which I cannot unmute people. For security issues and privacy, the one who leads a Zoom meeting cannot unmute. I can mute, I cannot unmute. Cannot hear you.
Joe?
Oh.
We know that the annexation of 100% of the West Bank is very unlikely. There was talk about doing pieces of it, especially the pieces that you mentioned earlier around Jerusalem and near the border. What do you think the likelihood is that something like that will happen as opposed to nothing along the lines of annexation?
Oh, if something will happen, it's only that. Netanyahu will not annex more than these areas. And some say that he might even take some tiny symbolic piece of it, say this is now annexed and that's it, because he gave his word. He put his entire reputation on annexing the part of the West Bank on July 1st, okay? But there is so much resistance. And I still believe what I said in the beginning. It's not Netanyahu's decision, it's Donald Trump's decision. Without green light from Donald Trump, he's not going to do it. It's just not going to happen. Okay, my friends, so I want to thank you for joining me for this class tonight. I hope I gave you a little bit of information. And now I'm completely personal. I hope this annexation idea of the unilateral annexation will not happen in the next 4 months. And annexation ultimately will be part of some greater plan, but not something that will be done in a rush way. Thank you. And
Thank you.
I will see
Thank
you
you.
soon.
Very good.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.